Thank you so much, Laura. I know Darkhan, we work together, but also, of course, Aida and Zakir and Mike. So I've been working closely with them. It's wonderful to be here. It's a wonderful institution that you have, Nazarbayev University. It's, I think, one of the best in research in education. So very happy to be here. And as Laura said, I will keep it a little bit short because my voice, I don't think will carry through all the time. My head is working, but my voice is not that great at the moment. I got the common cold, but still, so I will speak for maybe half an hour, but hopefully we still have an interesting discussion afterwards. Also, we just make everything shorter, but hopefully effective. So let me pull up the slides so you see what I'm going to talk about. Usually I talk about policy, borrowing and lending because this is my area of research. But by now I think everybody, a lot of people know about it. And I thought I would talk about a newer topic. And I'm sure you can see it now, can you? Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So what you will see here is about 3 things that I would like to talk. All of them are like hot topics at the moment. One is the whole notion of global public goods, which is becoming fast, very popular because the World Bank and Global Partnership for Education are advocating to reflect on global public goods and what that means for policy and planning in education. Then the second is what I would call from a sociological perspective, the structural coupling between science and politics. I'm in comparative policy studies. We call that actually policy planning, evidence-based policy planning, but that's a more sophisticated and more correct way of putting it. It's like an overlap of science and politics, 2 different spheres sociologically, so we'll talk about that. And they're all connected actually with the issue of how to cope with the surplus of evidence. One of the things my colleague Chris Lubinsky from Indiana stated, and I agree with him, because of these global public goods that are publicly available, we are in an era where there is too much information. There is data mining, there is evidence mining, there is toolkits mining, everything. So the question is, how do governments cope with the surplus of evidence? And here I will mention briefly a study that we do in the Nordic region, in Scandinavia, in Europe and Finland, and report back on what we find, how governments deal with it. So the notion of global public goods, if you look at it more closely, it can be anything, even anything that transgresses or flows over national boundaries is a global public good, especially if it's cheap. So in effect, actually a clean environment is a global public good, or property rights, or peace and security. But in education, we use that concept to look at open access knowledge, which Google and internet hugely facilitated. And since 1995, for instance, Google Scholar is recording everything that is getting published, mostly in English, I have to say. But also international data banks. And on the right side is an example of OECD, the education GPS. But also in my classes, I use UNESCO Institute for Statistics data banks, or UNESCO IIP in Paris, or World Bank data. There's so many data banks. And in fact, every international organization, depending on what their core business is or agenda or topic, thematic experience, they all have data banks. And we will talk about it, why. Then toolkits, similar, like I think in Russian you call that skeleton. Sometimes templates, you call them skeleton. I like that term. So all these toolkits where people have like a prescriptive way of filling in gaps and then use them for their own national purposes or for their own local purposes. So many. UNESCO Bangkok has. Acer Australia have, 2 of our partners But UNESCO IIP, again, every organization, and it started off with saying, let's collect cases, and then good cases of what works. Then it becomes different things merged together. The UK push for what works centers, together, with the US push and other push for best practices. In some countries, they are called good cases or case studies. But basically what these international toolkits are, it's a very practical way of integrating the last one, international best practices. So it is not just that nowadays, and remember, I worked 10 years for government in Switzerland, so I'm a civil servant at heart and an academic. It's all about policy studies and school reform. So in the beginning, the toolkits and the instruments were about how to analyze a problem. What data needs to be collected to analyze the education sector. So it was all analytical and diagnostic, we would say. But now the international best practices and even the data banks, they are very much prescriptive, not just how we should analyze a problem, but what should be implemented in terms of best practices and what works. Of course, always with local and national adaptation. So this whole discussion on global public goods really went viral in the last few years, but of course there are issues with it. On the left side actually addresses some of them. One of the critiques that I also criticized in the handbook that Karen Mundy edited with Anthony Berger and with Bob Lingard and Green from London, it's about globalization, forgot the title, is that just what I said now, that all these international standards are not just that they advocate for what should be the optimal school size. If you listen to EFA Fast Track Initiative, it should be 35 students per class. What should be the optimal instructional hours per year? How many hours should students go to school? Again, there was at one point the benchmark of 850 to 1,000 hours per school for primary level. What should be the ideal salary of the teachers? These are all international benchmarks. And what the World Bank and EFA at that time advocated for, that the teacher salary should be 3.5 times the average per capita salary in a country. So you should figure out in Kazakhstan whether that applies. So if the average per capita GDP in Kyrgyzstan would be, I'm just making that up, $1,000 a month, a teacher is supposed to earn $35,000 a year or month. 1,000 a month or 12,000, then the teacher should earn 3.5 times as much. So what I'm trying to tell you is that these global benchmarks are also norm setters. They establish what is a norm. And I know in Central Asia, you have a normative about many things. And in fact, a big part of the job of the Ministry of Education and of any line ministry is to establish norms. Norms for number of students, norms for the size of the bench, norms of qualification of teachers. So what happens, and that will be an interesting discussion, how do national government officials deal with the fact that nowadays international organizations, all they do is they establish norms? And we can discuss. Can you just mute Laura? That would be good if Laura could mute. Okay. Can you?
Yes. I'm trying to find that person. Please mute yourself. Who's that?
Okay. So this is a new phenomenon that international organizations and political scientists say, international organizations, they're not NATO that have weapons. They are not They're not the EU that throw out countries if they don't comply. It's more like the Bologna Agreement. It is like, in the absence of real power, they establish norms and agreements and they compare. They publish numbers, and that in itself generates pressure. So in the absence of real power and coercion, numbers become the means of governance. That's why we, in one of the last NORRAG special issue, where Nazarbayev University is our partner for the Russian version, we looked at global monitoring of national development. Remember, there's so many organizations that have global monitoring reports. The most famous in our field is the one by UNESCO, the Global Education Monitoring Report. The last version was on inclusion, but we also have the World Bank. Until 2016, was not a bit interested in education, not at all, not at all. But starting in 2016, as part of the Human Capital Project, the World Development Reports, that they also, it's like a global monitoring report, also deals with tracking human development because of the Human Capital Index that they developed on the project. For this reason, the two colleagues, Jennifer Oskar, who retired, but Soteria Gregg, who's still there, in Edinburgh University, they coined the term governance by numbers. And interestingly, it's not just international organizations. When I used to be in the ministry, the way we would govern is, as inspectors, we would show up in a school unannounced, and we would look if the laws and regulations were implemented. This is so completely different than in the year 2020. In the year 2020, schools have to submit a self-evaluation. They get indicators, they get even benchmarks, what they're supposed to achieve, and they themselves collect data. And the people in the ministry sit behind their desks in the offices, and they look at these self-evaluation reports. And if they are not doing well, there's a series of remedies. Different systems have different ways of coping with failing schools or substandard schools, but it is really governance by numbers. My colleagues from Finland, from Tampere University, Nelly Piatoeva and Jaakko Kauko, they say it's not just governance by numbers, it's governance by data circulation. For a government just to circulate the data, how which province is doing, in itself is very powerful. It generates, every type of comparison generates policy pressure, especially on poor performing districts or schools or what have you. So my colleague from Melbourne, Radhika Guru, she wrote a piece that is really a great title, Seeing Like PISA. Everything is about seeing, like putting everything into comparison, into numbers and comparing yourself. Now, when we talk about global public goods and the massive amount of data, international data banks, toolkits, best practices, there is one issue, and this is the lack of uptake at the national level. Mostly international consultants, international scholars like me, we are interested, we read, we build our careers on that. But national government officials don't really use that as much, unless they have, but Kazakhstan is not in that position, unless they are from a poor country where they depend on loans and grants. And for the duration of the loan application, they use those data banks because this is what international organizations want to hear. But afterwards, there is in reality actually not much uptake or utilization at the national level of all this massive amount of data. Two colleagues tried to understand more from a philosophical perspective. Why is it that politicians prefer numbers over studies, essays, texts? What do you think? Maybe you should put it in your chat box. Why do politicians love numbers, love comparison? What is it? Okay, I can see a couple. Yes, my numbers over now. Thanks, Matthew, for making that. Ah, okay. Darkhan, interesting. Okay. Okay, interesting, Sabir. I didn't know that. Okay, so let me discuss, Matthew, why are, for you, numbers a narrative? Good to meet you. Hi, Matthew.
Nice to meet you. So a number is just a narrative. It's a measure of what happened. Did the kid get the question right or not? That's...
Okay, this is, not sure this, okay, this is, I agree with this example, but how about a ranking when it says in PISA, country X is on rank 10, or when it comes to climate change, this country scores that many points.
Hold on. Ranking is PISA ranking. It's quite empirical. It's a fact.
Okay. Okay, but I would say the interpretation, it's information, but it's not meaning. If we differentiate between knowledge that carries a meaning and information and knowledge that carries information, would you agree that the meaning is not embedded in a number, but it gives the freedom to interpret that finding? For instance, yes, I agree with Matthew, the student either failed or passed, but why exactly? Or yes, let's agree, such and such country ranks 10 on PISA or scores 650 on climate change. But why? So one of the reasons why politicians like numbers, and especially international comparison, and this is what Espeland and Gore wrote about, is because they can attach their own interpretation, their own meaning for the number, for the score, for the ranking. So they can use it as an instrument for politics, for political decisions, and for political decision-making, which they couldn't be doing it if they would have like a review or expertise of someone who in detail gives a qualitative analysis with the reasons and rationale, etc. Since Darkhan is my friend, I'm going to give the floor to Darkhan also. Go ahead, Darkhan.
Well, writing is certainly easier, but I hear over and over again, you know, that those international comparative studies and all this is like a neo-colonialism, you know, with international organizations imposing certain policies, and you're certainly an expert in this. But I just want to say that, you know, in themselves, those like policies, the traveling policy, or, you know, numbers, the rankings, that actually are a stimulus for a lot of countries to develop. Just like Germany, for example, reacted to PISA by improving their education system. And Finland keeps, you know, maintaining their high level. So,
but this is actually supports the point that the reason politicians like it is they can use it as an instrument for political decision-making. Mm-hmm. So they can either generate pressure for change, or they can alleviate and say, you're doing fine, you know. But for this very reason, sometimes, and there's many studies about it, and I studied myself, not every result gets reported because it can be used for political purposes by generating reform pressure if the score is low, or for alleviating reform pressure. For instance, even in Japan, and this is not just in authoritarian countries, in Japan, they just had, the first piece, TIMSS result was really doing well, Japan. TIMSS, I think 1995. That's a very old one. But then the results came, and they were just before establishing a major revamp of math education. So the team's results came back and said, you know what, Japan ranks top or the first three. So this was actually not such a good result because they wanted to justify the need for reform. Same, for the 1995 teams, the US did not do well, they never do well, but they did, you know, above OECD average, but it was like really used to scandalize the US education system. And why? Because they wanted to implement the reform, a justification to generate reform pressure. So this is just to come back about why politicians love governance by numbers. It also has to do with something else that I think nobody really mentioned. Remember I told you I'm not very young. So when I was in the Ministry of Education in Zurich in the 80s and a government official working in public service, we would govern and regulate inputs, not outcomes. The move from inputs to outcomes is all the difference also. We would govern by checking whether the schools really listened to us, whether they were in compliance with our normative standards, you would say in Central Asia, whether they really follow the rules and regulation. So it was regulation by checking compliance. But as part of the neoliberal reform that took place in every country of the world, starting in the 90s, regulation is not done by inputs, but by outcomes. Because the whole part of neoliberal reform or market-driven reform is to say, we should give liberty and freedom to the schools, how they teach, as long as they're successful in making students learn. So what we are measuring is outcomes, learning outcomes. That's one of the reasons why there are so many tests now. So that move from input regulation, that everyone needs to comply and follow the standards, it is more on monitoring whether the outcomes have been reached in terms of learning benchmarks, standardized tests, what have you. Let me move on. Doing something wrong? Yes. The second point, did I just skip something? Hold on, let me just check. Yes. So the second point is what is usually called evidence-based policy planning. But from a sociological perspective, it is actually two fields that are supposed to be different are now getting closer together. For instance, the field of science is all about true, and this is Niklas Luhmann, I'm a systems theorist actually. Science is all about true or not true. Politics is about power or not power, or decision-making and not decision-making. Health is about sick or not sick. So all these, they all have different codes and they all have different things of regulation. Now, something that has become was very common in some countries went global. The fact that before politicians make a political decision, they ask experts, usually academics or researchers, to produce green papers. So these expert commissions or expert panels. So this is called green papers, what scientists produce. And usually it's about reviewing the past reform and making recommendations on how it needs to be adjusted for the next one. Many, many countries, this is the case. It's the case in every single European country. This is just called evidence-based policy planning. It always existed, but usually in these commissions, there were a combination of researchers, civil servants, interest groups. So for instance, teachers associations, churches, political parties. So these three groups used to be represented in these expert commissions. So in political science, study after study shows that these expert commissions have completely changed the composition. There are more and more academics and researchers giving advice to government. It used to be that academics were very academic, very abstract. They would sit in libraries and they would produce stuff that their students would read. But beyond that, there was no expectation that research should really have an impact on society and on reform. So because of that, and of course, those academics, it's contested, and we can talk about it in the discussion. Some people that are like hardcore academics and still work in libraries only say, oh, what you're doing is not really research, it is agenda-driven research, it is policy-driven research. You just say what you're paid for. It is not really free foundational research. But anyways, this is a trend that happened, that science has become an advisor for politics, but also politics produces its own evidence. Politicians and governments, they engage in data mining on their own. As I said earlier, nowadays, rather than government officials going and making surprise visits to schools to see whether they are in compliance with the rules and regulation, schools submit reports. Districts submit, evaluation reports themselves. So all this data gets collected and analyzed. And what happens is like what we have, what I said earlier at the global level, there's a global monitoring of national development, but in each and every country that is truly has adopted, neoliberal reforms, what we are witnessing is a national monitoring of local developments or school development by comparing and making it transparent. In some countries, they put it on the web to generate pressure for change and for improvement. There's a lot of discussion about the politicization of science. As I said before, hardcore academics say, oh, you are just poo-pooing, you're not real academics, you're working with politics, it is agenda-driven. But then also, there is also this phenomenon of scientization of politics. There's an old study by Weingart and Lensch. They looked at these scientific advice in policymakers, in policymaking, expert commissions, and these are German scholars. They said there are three different phases in how scientific advice is given in policymaking. It started in the 1950s, where government would insist that the academics and university are autonomous and unbiased, that they give their own independent judgment on policy decision. And that was a model, because this way government could say, it's like Fauci in the US right now, the health of and pandemic official, he says, I am impartial. I am not part of any partisan, I don't do partisan decisions. I'm beyond party politics in the US. I'm the pandemic expert. And governments actually should be liking that, because this way they can justify their political decision by saying the decision on whether there should be a lockdown for Corona or not, and the health of the nation literally has been pronounced by health experts independently. We don't influence them. So it used to be that in the 1950s, governments would insist that the advice that they get from academics should be totally depoliticized, totally autonomous within themselves, and based on foundational scientific knowledge. Then a big change happened with neoliberal reform, and more what we call mode 2 knowledge, which I will explain in a minute, it's on the right side, emerged. That they said, we don't want these academics sitting in libraries producing stuff nobody reads, or just their own students and their colleagues. we want policy relevant research. In some countries, like in the US, we also call it, depending on whether you produce it for government, if it's for government, it's called policy relevant research. If it's produced for civil society, it's called transformative research. But it's the same thing. If you ask me, I'm a government person, so I don't think there's a slim line between transformative research that has an impact on people and civil society, or if you call it policy relevant research, which has an impact on government decisions on reform. But there was this whole thing in the 80s, 90s that academics should stop doing this very highly academic research, especially in the social sciences and education research, and they should produce policy relevant research. Then the third and most recent move was to say, wait a minute, researchers are not the only experts. The users are experts, actually, because we get feedback from users, from parents, from schools, and some of the feedback we get from schools is in the form of numbers. If a school loses students because we have free school choice, students can choose to any school they want, or parents can choose rather, then those schools that are selected by parents are the better schools. So this is a number, this is data, this is expertise. So the users are experts. And you know that term that is used in internet and information technology about, what is it called? Prosumers, people that produce and consume at the same time. We consume internet, but by downloading things, there's so much research done on what we download and what we view, including, how to confirm our identity by clicking on 3 red lights or 3, fire hydrants. So we use data, but we also produce data because we click by clicking and viewing something. We are the one producing the data. So that term producer, prosumer, mixture between producer and consumer is now used in internet technology research. But this last phase, it's called actually democratization of scientific policy advice. It's not just researchers that are asked, but also user groups. User groups have become, it used to be that political parties and churches were interest groups and unions, but now the users are the interest groups. They want, because it's like a basically direct feedback system. So anyway, we have, earthquake, landmark, really huge changes in how policy is made in the last 30, 40 years. And of course, as a policy studies person, I find it fascinating to follow these changes, because I started as a practitioner in policymaking and now studying it. And that change in knowledge production has also, German scholars call that mode 1 knowledge and mode 2 knowledge. Mode 1 knowledge is foundational research. I think what you would in Central Asia call what the academies do. And mode 2 research is what think tanks do, NGOs do, others that produce research, but for usage, for policy usage, that try to solve an issue rather than have foundational research. So number 1 is foundational research, knowledge. Mode 1 relies on peer review, publishing in specific academic journals. It is disciplinary. You're either sociologist or political scientist or anthropologist. You have to make a decision what your discipline is. And there's a big gap between theory versus practice. In mode 2 research, which is now replacing more and more the mode 1 research, and I think a lot of academics regret that. It's not just positive, just to let you know. It's all about using science to help solve society's problems. And there's outside control. It's not just peer review academics checking on each other, whether they cite the right publications and the right scholars. But the issue of validity is very important. Like, is it valid? Is it useful? Does it have an impact? So for instance, something when, it used to be that it is absolutely forbidden in a PhD dissertation at Columbia University to make recommendations. And I have finished more than 60 dissertations in my life at Teachers College, Columbia Universities. Now, in the last few years, I noticed that the last chapter of a dissertation has recommendations. It was unheard of a couple of years ago that because PhDs are supposed to analyze and understand a problem, not have an impact on society, not make recommendations. So this has completely changed because theory and practice is connected. Similarly, there are more and more pressure to work across disciplinary boundaries. So it is considered innovative research if you are transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary. Big difference, which we use also in CAKES, and I keep bringing back CAKES. This is a project where Nazarbayev is one of our partners, and Zakir and Mike and Aida and Darkhan, they're part of our counterparts and very supportive, including in the course that we're teaching right now, where Darkhan is one of our instructors. So mode 1 research, remember, it's an old-fashioned research. The stakeholders or users of the research are only at 2 stages of the research process involved. At the beginning, to help formulate the research question, and then at the very end, when it's about using it. Needless to say, and unsurprisingly, there's very little uptake of that research because it's abstract. In the beginning, researchers in the mode 1 or traditional research make sure they have to explain the relevance of research. That's part of any PhD or any research project. Why is this project interesting and relevant? And then at the very end, they make recommendations. But in between, the stakeholders or users are not involved at all, which is completely different in mode 2 research. In mode 2 research, even the framing of the research question, the stakeholders, and you can see they're like put on top, and the researchers are serving the stakeholders. They're serving the target audience of research. They are involved at each stage, including analysis and recommendations.
Gita,
So I'm
sorry,
starting to lose my voice. Oh, go ahead, Zakir.
Gita, did you want to show the PPT? It's not illuminated currently.
Which one?
Your presentation. We cannot see your presentation.
Oh, are you serious? I'm all the time showing it. Thanks for letting me know. Wow. I am so sorry.
It's okay.
So sorry. Thanks for bringing that up. Wow.
Yeah.
I have it in front of me. I'm usually having a teaching assistant, so I'm really bad with this stuff. So sorry. So actually, this is what you missed. This overlap between science and politics, and then here, knowledge production, the 3 shifts. I will share it with Laura and she can share it with everyone. The 3 shifts that it started out with foundational research and then policyrelevant and then democratization, right? And then that big differentiation that the German scholars make between the 2 modes of knowledge, the one foundational research, the left side, and then here applied research. And this is where I just stopped. And the next one is what I just commented. And I just see there's a typo here, 2 modes of knowledge. So in the traditional one, As I said, the researcher is on top and the stakeholder is below. The researcher only involves the stakeholder or the user in the beginning. You can see it now, right? Yes. In the beginning, to formulate the research question, and at the end, to use it and to make recommendations. Now the stakeholder or the user is more important, is on top, and the researcher serves the stakeholders and involves the stakeholders, including framing of the question. And then when the data is collected, to analyze the data. And when the findings are formulated, to discuss the draft findings with the users and to then come to recommendations. So this kind of research is much more effective. And that's one of the foundations of KICS, actually. That is this model. Because we have national experts producing research that really make sure it's relevant, it's contextual, they know how to interpret the data. It's not someone sitting in Washington or in New York or in Geneva doing that for them. I have to unmute because I have to blow my nose. I'll be back in like 10 seconds, okay? You can talk among yourselves if you want. Sure.
And we have a very nice conversation and discussion in the chat as we observe.
It's more of a monologue, isn't
it? Matthew's monologue.
Matthew's memo, yeah.
Yeah, Matthew, you'll have a chance, yeah, to speak.
Oh, now this is just really helpful, actually. The mode 2, because Zakir and I and some others are going for some grants to work with the government, essentially, to do some work on big data. And our proposal spoke about working closely with stakeholders and having focus groups and trying to understand what they want and how that might be meaningful. So I should have actually used mode 2 in my proposal, then it would have been appropriate. But this is really helpful for our planning. And
so would you agree, Matthew, that in every RFP nowadays, it's always about, it has to be relevant, it has to be transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, what it has repercussions for PhDs, for instance. I nowadays ask my doctoral students that even during the data collection, they should share their preliminary results with the interviewees and ask whether their interpretation is accurate. Not just, withdraw in their own study or in the library and write up, but have an interaction at each stage of the.
Yeah, I mean, if research is going to be meaningful, right, then it can't be siloed, because too often us as researchers, we work in our own little bubble and world, and then they work in their world. So if we can work together to create a common understanding, then that's ideal.
So I'm actually starting to lose my voice, but let me make it very quickly, maybe another 5 minutes. So the last block, remember I said I will talk about the global public goods and about the overlap between science and politics. This is now finished. And the third part is about coping with the surplus of evidence. As I said, Chris Lubinsky, quoting him here, but also Paul Kearney, who did very interesting research on what he called polycentric governance, that it's not the government anymore that alone governs, but it's also like in some countries has never been, it's always the Ministry of Education and the cabinet or the presidential office. But in some countries, it's also now users and interest groups, etc. This is part of the democratization of evidence. It's also democratization of governance. So the question is now, what do you do with the surplus of evidence? Everyone talks about evidence-based policy planning or data-based policy planning, but there's a surplus, there's too much. So what happens now? And I use that definition of Kearney. Kearney says evidence is assertion backed by information. Another way of saying is evidence is an opinion backed by information. So this assertion is not neutral. That's why the information that is backing up that assertion has to be considered solid or robust. So for that reason, and that's my own more recent research, it has become very important to analyze the hierarchy of knowledge or information that are these days used. So for instance, from political perspective, government perspective, I don't say that this is how it should be. I'm critical myself. But nowadays, data and numbers are valued higher. They have a higher legitimacy than narrative.
Mm-hmm.
The only exception, I would say, in narrative, like governments love systematic literature reviews, but definitely not opinion pieces or essays that, you know, old scholars from academies, national academies that give their opinion. This is so outdated and passé. So it's really all about backing up your findings with data and numbers. Another thing is, nowadays, mode 2, is it still up, right? You can see it. Yep. Mode 2 has a higher legitimacy for policy decisions than mode 1, because the way the knowledge was produced involved stakeholders and users. Then the method of inquiry of policy research, and this is not good news for anthropologists, it's really more and more quantitative research. And even RCTs, you know, randomized control trials, are almost, especially for international organizations, are the gold standard in evaluations. And again, don't forget, it's not what I'm saying, and I don't think it's a good development, but this is how very often politicians see impact. They want to see impact evaluation, quasi-experimental design, randomized control trials, etc. And the profession of authors should not be politicians that make policy advice, but scientists. They want to draw on scientists that make recommendations. And depending on the source of information, in some countries, and it has to be international in order to have an impact. Even national knowledge is not, has low legitimacy. But that really depends on the country. So in European countries, the highest legitimacy is OECD. And we found that in the study that we did in Scandinavian countries. We looked at what studies do all those green papers and white papers cite, and we can see that OECD always comes up as a source for authorizing national reform. It, you know, OECD says, OECD thinks, OECD recommends. OECD is really, really important. This is not the case in the US. The US are very much isolationist. They don't really look at international recommendations. But relatively to others, even there, OECD is on the top. So this one, I'm running out my voice. I would have commented on that, but just to show briefly this political knowledge, what the white papers produce. And this is a Norwegian study, and because I'm visiting professor there at the University of Oslo. And this is what scientists produce in those green papers. So the only green paper that in Norway, that the Ministry of Education of Norway listens to is the one that is an OECD review. So this is to say, this is not an authoritarian government, it's a democracy. But even in democracies, OECDs have a higher value than own national expertise. Again, if you apply this whole idea from science to politics, this is the old model. The old model is scientists sit together, they give expert to government, and then at the end, there's a resolution and the parliament accepts something, right? It becomes a political decision. This is mode 1 research. Mode 2 is nowadays, it's more like this. It's like a spiral. At each level, scientists and politicians are involved and get involved in politics. It's not that the uptake is only at the end of a process, but at each stage there is an involvement of both parties. So in an era of, or surplus of data and surplus of global public goods, we have this phenomenon of polycentric governance, where the government, you have the National Ministry of Education. Some countries you have the National Cabinet or the Presidential Office. Even within a country, it's not just the Ministry of Education that makes decision. I think this is like a totally wrong theory, and it never was like that. So it's always more than one. In some countries, the Ministry of Finance is more important than the Ministry of Education for policy decisions. But definitely, Ministry of Education, but also Presidential Office, and depending on the country, also OECD and World Bank are part of this governance or interest groups, depending on the country. So again, start talking with each other. I'm going to blow my nose. I'm going to get out, and then I come back in 10 seconds, okay? And I'm going to pull down now so we can talk better a little bit.
All right. Right.
Oh, hey, Zakir, how are you? Are you good?
Good, good. Maybe we'll ask Elaine to comment. She has many comments.
Cool.
Elaine. I'm also wondering if Jason wants to share some of his thoughts. So Jason, Jason is the person who actually introduced Gita to us, to many of us. Elaine, if Elaine is here.
Okay, I'm back. Go ahead. So Elaine and Jason are here.
No, I think this is a really interesting conversation, obviously, and I guess I think it has special meaning. Well, in Kazakhstan, for example, sometimes OECD research on the national education system here is justified in policy discourse because of the lack of national assessment knowledge of the education system. So it's sort of a need to externalize and use the OECD data because it's the best available data we have. So there's a pragmatism there that might be problematic. But I wonder what incentive then is there for a national education system, maybe like Kazakhstan, to really develop a national assessment system so they could get their own knowledge of their own system? Why not just use OECD? For example, PISA, why not just work with PISA to collect the data you want, the background knowledge, to this, to that? I guess I'm wondering. Yeah.
That's a good point, Jason. I mean, every single European country does the same as Kazakhstan. They invite OECD to come and make a review of their national education system, because there's a mixed group of experts, but also many national experts are in it. And because OECD is able to compare. The question is, does the government then use it? Here in Norway, they do use the OECD, but also use others. I'm so sorry, but I have to end here. I suggest that Zakir and Jason, Matthew, Elaine, everyone have a discussion among yourselves, and then Laura tells me how it done. But I'm completely losing my voice.
Oh yeah. Sorry about that, Gita. Sorry about that.
It was a pleasure meeting you all.
You can just type, Gita. Just type on the chat, and we'll respond to each of your.
Okay, I have to go and take care of myself.
Okay.
It was good to see you all. Thank you so much, Laura
Nice
and
to meet you.
everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Gita.
much.
Thank you so much.
Really useful.
Please get well soon.
Thank you so much.
Mm.
Bye. All right. Jason, please.
Well,
The floor is yours.
I'll just say, Laura, I mean, thank you for this. This is great. This whole video will go into my globalization and education course this spring for the PhD year 1 students. But I think this was great, and I enjoy all the chat, and I will enjoy this conversation as it moves forward right now. But this has been tremendous. I'm thinking all kinds of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And this is the first time you are attending the research seminar.
Oh, well, you know, it might be worth noting that, you know, just a little bit of history. So at GSE, we've been talking for a very long time about developing our capacity to use large-scale international assessment data, and whether for a range of purposes, for research and also for policy help nationally. And Zakir knows this well, and Duishan, Ali, Daniel, and myself, going back now for 4 years or more. I mean, we've been sort of trying to stir this pot, and I'll be super quick here. There's been movement forward on these questions. You know, working with the Information Analytics Center and working with NIS schools and so on to try to see what is the national capacity for doing this kind of work, whether critical or supportive of education policymaking research. And we've taken some steps, and now there's all this movement in the school to start doing this kind of work. And we heard Matthew and Zakir talk about this a little bit. So this is an exciting time for GSE, and I hope we see more and more student research around this area. We've been working hard with our quantitative methods instructors to develop more student capacity to do this kind of work. So I'll stop now, but I'll just say, like, that's kind of the moment we're at, and that's where this conversation fits in, and it's really super interesting and helpful.
Thank you, Jason.